Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to another Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. I'm glad you're joining me on this new year, and we are picking up once again with the second part of our top 10 countdown of top podcasts of 2023. We did numbers 10 through 6 last week, and now we're rounding out the top 5. So stay with me as we'll explore such diverse topics as intelligent design, J.R.R. Tolkien, and how an atheist scientist can come to believe in the living God. Well, welcome again. As I said, it's a new year. Glad to be with you. Right now, I'm actually on my way to the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, speaking at their Defend Conference for the first week of 2024. So I thought I would leave you with this top 5 list of the most popular podcasts from our 2023 year. As I had said before, this is a kind of a new format for us. We've done audio podcasts since 2006, believe it or not. So we've been doing podcasting for quite some time, ever since actually you used to use iPods to listen to these things before phones were doing it. But now everything's moved over to the video platform, and this long format YouTube is really how we're making new ground and exploring topics in a much broader manner. And it's been successful. People are engaging with it, as you'll probably find out from the highlights we're going to show you from these upcoming podcast series. Now, the first one that I want to talk about, coming in at number 5, was my opportunity to talk with my friend Austin Friedman. We had known each other for a number of years. We've both explored how popular media, in my case, I've done a lot of work in looking at how superhero movies kind of reflect some of the basic understandings and desires for justice and right and wrong, and how the superhero genre is actually a type of Christian mythology. And Austin is a scholar of J.R.R. Tolkien. And we have an interesting discussion in the podcast, How Tolkien's Faith Fueled the Lord of the Rings. And we talked about a lot of things. The question of God obviously comes up in the Lord of the Rings. Some people say that, Tolkien never meant this to be anything that talks about God. But as Dr. Freeman explains, no, there's a much deeper aspect to it. So here's Austin.
Is always something of the odd man out because of his background and because of his religious faith. I mean, when C.S. Lewis comes to Oxford, he's got a very famous letter that says, when I got here, I was told never to trust a philologist or a Roman Catholic, and Tolkien was both. Despite that, I think that Tolkien's close-knit community of friends like C.S. Lewis and Lewis's brother Warnie and other people like that are going to be very important for him. You're going to see that in his stories, these small groups of very dedicated, loyal people that are on a mission in an otherwise much grander, hostile story. I think that there's something of his background in that.
Yeah, and so unlike Lewis, though, Tolkien wasn't trying to create an analogy in his. As a matter of fact, he kind of despised those kinds of ideas. Even though Lewis in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, it's almost a parable that Lewis is building. Tolkien wanted to just do something different that maybe, but it was permeated with a deep Christianity, and it was that, and maybe that's why it makes it so universal. Maybe that's why Tolkien. I mean, Lewis's books, Narnian books, of course, were popular as well, but they didn't seem to have the same cachet as Tolkien, especially with adults, until maybe 20, 30 years ago. Why do you think that is?
So to begin with, yes, Tolkien and Lewis are doing very different things in their books. Just because they're fantasy worlds, it does not mean that they're on the same mission. So for Lewis, he's doing what he calls a supposal. Suppose that Jesus Christ becomes incarnate in a place like Narnia with talking animals and witches. What would it look like? What sort of an incarnation would that be? But for Tolkien, because of his theology of literature, he wants to rely less on the author constructing these hidden meanings and more on allowing those meanings to arise from the shared human psyche, we might say. So for Tolkien, he says that the Christian elements are subsumed into the story and into the metaphysics itself, the metaphysics of the world, right? So the nature of good and evil, or what does real victory look like? What does real sacrifice look like? Those are the Christian elements. Because for Tolkien, he says Middle Earth is our world. It is not a separate dimension the way that Narnia is. It is our world in a mythic past. And so if God has not revealed himself to Abraham, if Jesus Christ has not become incarnate, then you can't talk about anything to do with revealed religion yet. It would be anachronistic. It would spoil the setting of the story. It's like in Blazing Saddles or whatever, when they drive off in the sunset in a Cadillac, right? That it takes you out of the story. And Tolkien really believes that the genre of myth speaks to something within the image of God in which human beings are created. He does not want artistically to jar people out of that experience. And so he's got to walk a very fine line. Yeah, Tolkien does not like allegory, but he's defining allegory in an idiosyncratic way there. I think when most people hear Tolkien say he cordially dislikes allegory in all its forms, what they take him to mean is, don't look for any deeper meaning in my story. It's just a story. Right. There's a person on my Amazon book page that gave me a 1-star review because they said Tolkien didn't intend any meaning behind any of this, which is of course ridiculous, right? All authors that are good at their craft want some subtext there. What he means is allegory in the sense of a one-to-one correspondence that the author controls, right? So a sort of a secret decoder ring approach to fiction. Instead, Tolkien believes that God has intentionally freighted the world with this hidden depth of meaning, this sort of transcendence that he's picking up from the Romantic authors. And if we confine it to a one-to-one correspondence, then we're actually making it a lot more shallow than we would if we were to leave it to the audience's own personal interpretation. And that's not to say that Tolkien is a reader response literary theorist. He just doesn't want to close those things off. I think we can picture what Tolkien's doing as a sort of a box with an open top, right? He wants to bound the symbols in a certain way. He wants to direct us to look at a certain place, but he is perfectly willing to have that overflow into other forms of meaning. So the ring is not the atom bomb. The ring is not Nazism or anything like that. He very specifically says that. But the ring has applicability to all sorts of things like the atom bomb or Nazism or things that Tolkien could not have foreseen, publishing The Lord of the Rings in 1954. So he's leaving it open for other people to see this sort of form of evil and fill that in with their own personal content. So that's where we have to look. If we're looking for Christianity in The Lord of the Rings, we've got to look at the form, or what he calls the shape of the story. And we can then apply whatever contemporary content we have into that form. The nature of Frodo's failure at Mount Doom applies to us today just as much as it did when Tolkien was writing, because it's not tied to a particular code. It is just a universal sort of human archetype, and that's where he sees the power of the story working.
Okay, at number 4, something that happened actually relatively recently. This podcast was put out in December and really caught fire. I was interviewing Dr. Seigart, who is an Origins of Life scientist, researcher, and one who described himself as a militant atheist. He, for most of his life, was a non-believer, didn't come to faith and wasn't baptized until he was 49 years old. And he was well entrenched in the scientific community at that time. So what was it that makes someone like Dr. Gart turn from a virulent atheism, a virulent anti-religion position, And someone who's so steeped in science, you would think that, there's no hope for him. Well, listen here as we talk about things like origin of life and how his discoveries about how science isn't necessarily the black and white issue that one would think, really started to open his mind up to alternative explanations of why we are existing and why the world is the way it is.
For a graduate student who's learning all the reality and details about how all these amazing machines and systems work in biology, it didn't make me a theist. It didn't make me believe in God, but it shook to the foundations my belief that everything is easily explained by scientific reason, and eventually we'll know everything. And that's just not true. It just turns out not to be true.
There's so much there. I know that in reading David Berlinski, how he talks about RNA world hypotheses, and you have, of course, the chicken and the egg problem, where you have the DNA and the transcription necessary in order to create the proteins, but you need the proteins in order to unlock the DNA. And then there's the folding issues that there's just, as you say, there's just so much there. And then in quantum physics, that's a whole other. Matter of fact, we're still struggling with that. I have, you read things like delayed choice double slit experiments, for example, which are seemingly not merely the fact that you can't predict whether it's going to act like a wave or a particle, but even if you choose not to choose ahead of time and you look after the fact, it's almost like the system knew you were going to choose in the future, and therefore in the past it recorded the system and it's just, my friend Michael Strauss, who works at CERN, I'm going to have to have him on and explain that to me, because I'm still wrestling with it.
Yeah, he's terrific. I've been reading his work recently, and wow, right on target.
Well, anybody who works at CERN, that's quite a gig for a.
And also his comment. We're on exactly the same page, only in different fields. So yeah, he's great. You were saying that people in ministry don't retire. Well, the other people who don't retire are scientists, and I have actually been working in science, not in a laboratory, but in theoretical biology. And my interest is the origin of life and everything around it. So I've actually published 3 or 4 papers. One is now, I just submitted another one, which relate to the origin of life. And it's a fascinating topic. And I'm sure you know who Jim Tour is.
Yes, he's getting quite a lot of publicity as of late.
He's getting a lot of attention, and he's a friend, and we talked about this, and he's completely right. We are so far from understanding how life could have possibly originated on this planet. And to me, and I think he would agree with this from what he said. As I said, we've had some discussions, but I think we're not going to make progress until we find an entirely new way of looking at the problem. And I think that that new way, or new ways, we don't know, are going to involve things that biology has excluded up till now, because they point too much to something outside of what we now define as the natural world. For example, purpose, teleology, agency. You can't use those terms in a biological paper today, although people are starting to do it, and they're not theists. There are people doing it because everyone has begun to realize it was a big mistake to rule out these things.
Right. Yeah.
In biological science. And it was only done to try to shore up biology as a, quote, real science, right? Because physics has no teleology. There's no purpose when a volcano blows up. It's just following laws. Biology is not like that. It's completely different. There's
an end to it. There's a target.
Exactly. So it's a fascinating subject. Getting back to my own story, I was nowhere near any of that at the time. I was just trying to make sense of what I was doing, and I wasn't really thinking about God in any sense by myself. What happened was, and again, this is detailed in the book, and I'm not going to go into any detail on it now because it would take too long anyway. But God came to me. uh, I had dreams, I had experiences. Actually, when I thought about it later, I realized it started when I was 16, a full atheist. I was being called, and eventually, the two dreams that I had were so powerful that I really had to start thinking that maybe there is something out there besides, the pitiless indifference that Richard Dawkins talks about, and something else going on. And I finally allowed myself to go to a church. A friend of mine asked me if I wanted to go, and I had never been in a church. I'm in my 40s now. I'd never been in any house of worship my entire life, and I was terrified, and but when I went, it was very nice. I mean, people were very friendly. They weren't. There was nobody being, burnt at the stake inside the church, which is kind of what I expected.
Wow. It's amazing how much we build up in our minds. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is. I mean, what I had the propaganda I had taken in as a kid was, you wouldn't believe it, and this is coming directly from the Soviet Union. This is hardcore stuff. And no, I didn't really expect to see, burning people, but I was surprised that people were welcoming. I mean, I was such a infidel, sinner, whatever you want to call it. I couldn't believe that they smiled at me. I mean, and I eventually started even reading that forbidden book, called the New Testament, which I had never looked at. I think I studied it a little bit at school, but with complete contempt. I don't even think I remember reading it, and was very surprised at what I read. First of all, some of it seemed like it was absolutely true. When I read the Book of Acts, I was expecting to see strong evidence of people making things up. Well, that's not what you get when you read the Book of Acts.
Yeah, it's very much not mythology.
It's history. It happened. I mean, this, and this, and then when you read the rest of the Bible, you realize, wait a minute, the good guys are not that good. What kind of a book is this? The heroes, King David, give me a break. I mean,
Yeah.
so
Even Peter, right? He's like
Peter,
Paul has to dress him down, and he
yeah,
puts his foot in his
yeah.
mouth more times than not.
And Paul himself, had his his issues, and and then I started reading what Jesus actually said, and he didn't say oppress the masses. He didn't say that at all. Quite the opposite. He talked about the lost, right? I mean, I don't have to tell you what's in the gospel, but that was a revelation to me. I mean, I was lied to, obviously. I mean, I already knew I'd been lied to about communism, but now I realized I was lied to about Christianity. And I was getting very interested in this, and I was getting very close, but I couldn't quite bring myself over until I had a waking experience, which is in great detail in the book, in my car alone, where the Holy Spirit came to me. And I mean, I can summarize it very quickly, which is simply that I was driving and I heard a Christian radio station and I turned it off. And I started thinking about what it would be like if I gave a sermon, which is already kind of crazy. Why would I would never give a sermon. And the next thing I knew, I was giving a sermon to myself, and words didn't come from me. And the bottom line of that sermon was that I was telling people, I know that Jesus loves all of you because he loves even me.
Wow. Wow, that's awesome.
I burst into tears, and I said out loud, I believe. That was it. And whew, the world changed. I mean, you've heard this many times, right? There's so many testimonies like that. Everything just changed. I was filled with joy. It's never left me. This was 15 years ago or more.
Wow. That's
And eventually, it took a little time, but I eventually became open. I mean, I believed in Jesus. I believed in God, but I didn't tell many people. I didn't tell my colleagues. I didn't know what to make. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know any other Christians. Eventually, though, I joined a church. I got baptized at the age of 65, and even became the lay leader in my church. So here I am.
Next is one of our early podcasts that actually gained a lot of traction. I'm in discussion with Tony Costello, who's a friend of mine and a fellow at the Kirkwood Center. And we decided to pick up a discussion on 4 different topics that are really rearing their head in modern society today. We talked about AI. We talked about the new rise in paganism. We talked about how Christian nationalism is starting to make headway, all kinds of things along that nature. You can listen into our conversation here as we delve into what paganism is and actually how it's really changing how people understand society.
There's a potential of totalitarianism in scientism. We saw that during COVID.
Yeah.
And there's an obvious potential for totalitarianism in critical theory. We're seeing that across the campuses in our nation right now.
And it's not it shouldn't be a surprise that anything that puts man at the apex of either knowledge or morality, when you're saying you're the ultimate arbiter, be it a group of guys in 1923 Germany or a group of scientists at the CDC or whomever, it shouldn't be surprising that because human beings are sinful, ultimately, it would lead to a totalitarian state. I mean, that's what we see when you start decoupling society from the Christian foundation from which it was birthed, then you start to see these cracks in the framework. You start to see things get a little shaky, and it won't be long before they all, collapse. We're already moving away from a guilt innocence society. That's clear, and we're going to an honor shame society, which is pretty much the default for most humanity. Where it's not your guilt or innocence that condemns you. It's whether you're saying the right things, doing the right things, being on the right side of history, et cetera, et cetera. Which leads us to our next point. Then ultimately, you revert back to what was before Christianity, and we're seeing this again in the neo-paganism movement. Matter of fact, I'm getting people telling me, "Hey, Lenny, you know what you really don't need to talk about? That's starting to happen in high school." Witchcraft and pagan resurgences. Those are the things that nobody in the pulpit is talking about. So this is a big concern that a lot of people have, and parents are not even necessarily aware of it yet.
Yeah. Well, and this was something that came up in my discussion with Owen Anderson at ASU as well, who was pointing out that there's these invocations being held now to pre-Christian. So there's been a history at a lot of institutions of doing these apologies to Native American,
right?
Land grabs, right? Where the institution you're working at, high school, college, whatever, before a faculty meeting or something, you make a formal apology to the Native American tribe upon whose stolen land your institute sits. And again, is there some truth in this? Yeah, maybe, of course. I mean, especially if you can identify, if that land really was to a particular part of a particular tribe that then got sent off to some reservation. We get it. We're taking all of history, warts and all, into account. But it's gone further now than just an apology. There's actually more like invocations, the closing the eyes, folding the hands. Now, an even more egregious form of this was reported by Christopher Rufo, the journalist, who was talking about right up here in LA County a couple of years ago. I wrote a series of articles on this, where school children, K through 12, on some kind of, I don't know, it was a Mexican Heritage Day or something, were being taught Aztec, were being taught or compelled to say invocations or prayers to specific Aztec deities, Quetzalcoatl, in the name of social justice. A very odd, bizarre synthesis of Marxism with ancient paganism, religion. So there was an invocation to this Aztec god of war, Quetzalcoatl, and for the sake of bringing social justice and equity to our nation. And school children were saying these things. And, now some people might think, well, this is just a social phenomenon. We don't really believe that Quetzalcoatl exists. But, if you believe that Quetzalcoatl really does exist or potentially exists as something like a demonic god, which if anybody has read the history of the Aztecs, when Paul talks about powers of principalities, spiritual elemental forces of the air, from which we've been liberated from that. It starts to you start to become, and then of course couple that with the anti-colonialism of our day, which is nothing new, but the strong anti-colonialism only brought evil, to native shores, right? Well, of course, it also brought the gospel to native shores. But the anti-colonialism, and also in the critical theory, and especially the critical race theory literature, and I've looked at this, where there's an attack on what is oftentimes called Eurocentricity, reason, dichotomous reason, logical thinking, rationalization, and in some journal articles, the desacralization of nature. That what also the Europeans brought, or the rationalists or the Enlightenment Europeans brought, was sort of this idea that nature is not imbued with its own innate powers and spiritual forces,
right?
But that it's a creation. So this is just Jewish religion. This is just Old Testament truth, right? So all of this kind of comes together, and I think it shouldn't surprise us if we start to see a return, not just to New Age, which has been with us for a while as an alternative way to seek spirituality, but an actual return to pre-colonial, the worship of pre-colonial folk religions.
And that's and the reason why that's dangerous is because, again, any religious system isn't hermetically sealed. It doesn't stand outside of a larger sphere of understanding. So Quetzalcoatl has to be appeased. And there was a way that the Aztecs would appease them. They would take the captured enemies and they would basically slaughter them alive. They would open up their chests and present their beating hearts to, and they did this. The Aztecs did this. And the archaeologists have basically found the bones to note it. They estimate about 80,000 victims over the course of 1 century. That's a lot of human sacrifice.
Yeah.
Molech, you had to lay out the children, right? So in any sex-driven culture, population control is always the issue because babies come from sexual intercourse. That's just what sexual intercourse does. Is it's meant to produce babies. And so you've always got a baby issue if you have a sexual culture issue. And so how do you dispose of those? And it's usually through some kind of sacrificial system. Now, we try to do ours clean behind Planned Parenthood closed doors, but it's still the same issue. And as that starts to escape, we're going to have more and more problems. This is one of the reasons why neo-paganism, and paganism by its nature then starts to pit certain groups against one another. It actually does the opposite of what it's claiming to do in the critical theory sense, and it actually creates hierarchies because my God is better than your God, and my God needs to be appeased. Right. Okay, getting close. Top 2. Here's another podcast that really gained a lot of traction partially because of the guest. This is an interview with Dr. Stephen Meyer, who has been around for a long time. I've known Stephen for a little while. I've known of him even longer when his book Signature in the Cell came out some 10, 15 years ago. He has been the president of Discovery Institute and one of the leading proponents of intelligent design really across the world. But he was recently interviewed on the Joe Rogan program, which of course brought amazing notoriety. And so we were fortunate enough to talk with Dr. Meyer right after the Rogan interview and got to explore some of the things that happened there. In this clip, I'm talking about the Dover case, which was a pretty famous case that happened in 2005, decided by a judge as to how you can teach creation or intelligent design in the classroom, and what the ramifications of that decision were. It was a lot of folks kind of writing off the intelligent design movement as being dead. And as Dr. Meyer explains, that's not true at all. It's anything but. So listen in. And this actually brings up another question. You know, it famously, the Dover case, what was that, 97, something like that?
It was 2005, but yeah, that's
we are so much further along than that. And I'm wondering, because we do see a groundswell in popular culture, I'm wondering if that were to say play out, do you think some of the variables that kind of fed into that case would be different today?
Well, yeah, quite possibly. The staunch Darwinists after the Dover case were dancing on our graves, saying it's over after Dover, perhaps not realizing that many of the most prominent people in the ID movement elected to stay out of that trial. Scott Minnick and Mike Behe did testify to defend their own work on the irreducible complexity of molecular machines, which had been maligned by some of the ACLU witnesses. But I chose not to testify. And part of the reason for that was we just thought the whole thing was very poorly framed. Mm-hmm. The local school board, which was, I suppose, well-meaning, had a fairly innocuous policy of having teachers read a statement telling students that there was a book in the library that discussed the theory of intelligent design. It ought to have been a yawner, but there were a couple things about it that the way they framed the policy that we didn't like. One is that it did mandate that the teachers read this statement, and we thought that was probably a bad idea. But more importantly, at the hearing where the policy was being discussed and advanced, one of the board members encouraged other board members to do this for the crucified one. And so this was an explicit statement of religious purpose, which by the Lemon test we knew was not going to pass muster in the court. And it was, of course, completely unnecessary and superfluous to what was being discussed, but that's what was on the record. And so we had urged the school board to withdraw the policy. And but there was a non-for-profit legal group that wanted to have the fight, and so the fight went on with the ACLU, and so it was just kind of a train wreck. But I chose to stay out of it, even though part of the discussion legally is the definition of science, which is an area of special interest to me as a philosopher of science. Fortunately, the case has only legal standing within this one central district in Pennsylvania. So on a national level, the legal standing of teaching about the theory of intelligent design, not indoctrinating students into it or any other idea, the teaching about it remains to be clarified. We have not been pushing that. We've been much more concerned to advance the case for intelligent design and to use intelligent design as a guide to research at the highest levels of scientific discourse and research. And so that's the interesting thing, though, is that many of the books that have really put the ID case on the map. I mean, there were some good ones before, but there's some good ones that have come, and we've had a number of high-level scientific conversions to our point of view since Dover. I think Dover is just very far in the rearview mirror, and it's anything but the case that it's over after Dover. I think the ID research community is growing. We're attracting lots of young talent. We have young former students who are now tenured professors in their own right. And we've got books and articles, the number of peer-reviewed articles. About that time in 2005, the first peer-reviewed article, Advancing Intelligent Design, had just been published in 2004. That was the piece that I wrote that was published at the Smithsonian. We're at about 200 peer-reviewed articles now. And so this is, I think that's just an unstoppable force, in the sense that nature is testifying in ways that are making lots of people see what we see. And right. At a certain point, you just can't suppress that. And I think that's what's happening.
So the movement is really growing from within at this point. It's not just, you're knocking on the door and trying to say, look here, but there's now it's grown.
We're not worried about public school battles,
right.
We have advanced a policy that a number of state boards and local school districts have adopted, which is, if you're going to teach Darwinian evolution, teach it well, which means teaching the arguments for it, but also the arguments and evidence that challenges the theory as you find those arguments and evidences in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. That's just a matter of scientific literacy. The college level, there are plenty of professors who raise the ID issue. They've got academic freedom, or should, and honestly, we just have too many people breaking through into or senior professors who have come to our position, our perspective, who already have secure positions, and so it's getting harder and harder, I think, for the other side to suppress this. And some of the key public spokesmen for Darwinism are either into retirement years or no longer active, and so I just think the people that want to suppress discourse have moved on to other issues. And I think younger scientists are still very aware. If they hold our point of view, they've got to be careful within their department context and that sort of thing. There's a lot of great stuff being published, good books, good peer-reviewed articles, good research projects. We've made key predictions about, for example, junk DNA that have been confirmed by independent studies. So I don't think it's over after Dover.
All right, folks. So here is the top most watched podcast in our entire repertoire for the year. This podcast is interesting because it's based off of a book that I was reviewing with Harry Edwards and Jacob Daniel, who are my partners on the KKLA radio show apologetics.com radio. And we're looking at this book chapter by chapter. The book is Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, that really kind of unpacks about 3 centuries worth of history to show how our culture has shifted and fallen into this idea of accepting really crazy ideas like transgenderism, something that previous generations would never have even thought would make much sense at all. And in this chapter, we're looking specifically at Sigmund Freud. The podcast title is Freud's Poison: Corrupting Civilization Through Sex. And here I go on to explain just a little bit about how Sigmund Freud's philosophy and his ideology, driven by a sexual ethic, really does turn the tables, flips everything into something that's simply carnal, and why it can be very dangerous for any society. So listen in.
Freud, the teleology of human beings is sex. That's the end. So as we develop as human beings,
and again, it's very Darwinian in that sense, right? What's the Darwinian goal is to reproduce, to spread your genes.
That's
the
true.
Most successful species spreads his genes. Well, Freud takes that and then mixes it with the pleasure idea of sex, and so that's where it becomes, this must be scientific.
Right. And the interesting thing that Carl Trueman pointed out too, which I think is important for us to note, is because they've taken, they've just made, let's say, the act of sex very mechanistic, very Darwinian, let's say, very just limited to biology. Any form of what we might call as, let's say, sin, let's just call it that, is not sin in a Freudian sense. It's self-abuse, right? Again, you were talking, Lenny, about how we euphemisms for all of these things. So instead of masturbation as sin, it's still bad, apparently, but it's called self-abuse. And so you treat it like as a medical condition, not a moral thing. So the church no longer has any say to that.
Right.
But it's
right.
the medical community.
It becomes a medical. In other words, if you're over fixated, and there's a qualification that, because Freud wouldn't necessarily say that masturbation is wrong at all. He just says that if you're over fixated on it, then you're not expressing yourself fully as a sexual being.
Right.
And that's the problem. And it's interesting. People said one of the things that Freud actually did was he was the one that would purge the idea of perversion. To say something is a perversion, it means that a perversion is a deviation from what it should be, right? If you pervert someone's words, it means you're taking their words and you're twisting them so they mean something different than what the person originally intended. So with sex, there were ways that you would approach sex that were appropriate, that reflected what nature would have, but then there were ways that you would do it that were considered perversions. Homosexuality would be considered one of those in the 1880s, let's say. And Freud tried to eliminate that stigma.
So help me understand this. I feel like Freud, again, forming his stages of human sexual development, had the phallic stage, and again, discovering our sexual organs, and yet apparently certain things are just perversions of it, even though apparently it's part of sexual development. That's where I'm a little confused with Freud.
Well, again, so he would, but even here, the phallic stage, I don't think anybody actually holds this anymore, because it's like it's an anecdotal. This is the frustration with these guys. It's very anecdotal. Do kids discover that they have genitals at some point? Well, yeah. I mean that happens, and maybe there's what you call frottage or rubbing or things like that. But it's not like Johnny never comes out of Johnny's 3 years old and he never comes out of his room anymore. That's not what kids are about. That's not their driving instinct. Any 3-year-old, that's not where he's focused. I mean, they may take their clothes off because they feel free, but it's not sexually driven. It's just understanding your world around you. And Freud just reinterprets it, and he interprets it in that way because he's trying to prove his point.
You mentioned the word fixation.
Yeah.
Would you say that our culture right now is fixated on those things?
Oh, absolutely. Exactly. Absolutely. I don't think that, I mean, you can't do anything because we say that sex is our identity. Yeah. It is who we are. It is who we are as opposed to what we do. And it's like, I live a gay lifestyle, or I live, you're cis or heteronormative. And ideas that we would have never talked about in public before are now put on our T-shirts. and people are getting shut out of the World Cup soccer matches because they want to show on their T-shirts what their sexual proclivities are.
And the progression is something like this. If you see people who are identifying in a certain way, it's not only that they are seeking affirmation. So it's not just in terms of the realization of that identity in our culture, which happens through various means and mediums, but it's also the affirmation of it, that it's something that one needs to affirm, because it is now about an object of their own identity. So if you do not affirm it, basically you attack the very individual and their identity itself. And that's where I think it gets really dangerous in terms of being fixated. So it's not something, as you said, we do. It's something we are. And that could lead people to various versions of sexuality, right? Because there's no standard by which we are putting any constraints around sexuality. there are no more constraints. So you have to add you have to add plus sign at the end of
Yeah.
because plus would mean anything.
Anything
right.
else.
Anything else.
Just because we were running out of letters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
Well,
don't know it yet.
We don't know yet.
Think of it this way. Name one other culture in all of human society where the cultural governing bodies or the major institutions that shape the culture are themselves supporting specific sexual unions, specific sexual acts, specific sexual developments. Here, I mean, we just came through October. Everybody changed the logos on their corporate brands, right? U.S. Soccer is putting rainbows on it, and we have the Navy and the Army and the White House is bathing itself in rainbow colors. Name any other culture in all of human history where sex is considered so central to its constituency that we have to trumpet, go out there and be sexual in this way.
I think it has a certain kind of power because it captures not just your body but also your emotions and your feelings, and it brings you to a place of pleasure that I think Freud is kind of touching on. That captures, it centers you to a place, and I think without any constraints, then you would want to actually reach to that point of attaining that pleasure.
Well, there you are. That's the top 10 podcasts for Come Reason. I hope you enjoyed those. You can watch any of those clips in their entirety, any of those podcasts in their entirety by just clicking on the links in the description below. And I hope you subscribe to this podcast because this year we'll have even more coming up. We'll have a lot of great interviews, a lot of great guests, a lot of exciting things happening. So again, I hope you have a happy new year. And until that time, we'll see you soon. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.